Hey internets, this video is going to be going over the rationalist argument against the wage gap, or how much of the existence of the gap can, in fact, largely be explained by examining differences in incentives between men and women and then pushing them to their logical conclusions. I decided it would be best to have a standalone video solely dedicated to this particular argument, since it's actually relatively unknown, which is unfortunate because it exposes a very big flaw in not just the wage gap, but in how leftists think in general. First off, I have to add a disclaimer, specifically the annoying little elephant in the room that pops up whenever this subject is on the table. I will be pointing out some very well-established biological differences between men and women. No, I am not claiming that women are inferior to men or somehow subhuman or anything like that. Yes, in fact, you can acknowledge that two groups are different without hating on or otherwise disparaging either one of them. Amazing novel concept, I know. But unfortunately, a lot of people tend to pull a false dichotomy here to conflate the two in order to falsely accuse anyone who talks about it from a non-leftist perspective of sexism. Accusing people you don't agree with of bigotry is unfortunately seen by a lot of these people as more effective these days than logical arguments. So I am thus forced to preemptively call out their fallacy before they make it. All I'm offering here in this video is the truth and nothing more. In fact, I strongly condemn misogyny because men and women getting along with each other is extremely important for any sustainable society with a healthy low time preference. Anyways, since I briefly went over this in my video on Paleolibertarian Feminism, I will now start this out by clipping the part of it that goes over the main argument. If you have already seen this part and remember it, feel free to skip to this section of the video while I'll be going over some points made by Unlearning economics, as well as some other additional fun stuff. The leftoid argument is that women make something less sense for every dollar men earns. The rightoid argument is that controlling for certain variables shows this is actually the result of free choice. The leftoid response is that those variables don't matter because reasons, and the rightoid response is that they do matter because reasons. There's actually an easier way that most people totally miss. Let's instead examine it from the perspective of incentives. And let's start this out by being super charitable to the environmentalist position. Let's assume that there are zero neurological or other major physical differences between men and women besides the simple fact that women have eggs and get pregnant and men have sperm. And let's assume that we want the same thing. Say both these people want a family. Well, the male knows that if he finds a wife and who wants to raise a family, there will likely come a time where she is out of commission for about a year and he will effectively have to economically provide for two people. This incentivizes the male to find work that pays well, even if that work isn't very flexible or psychologically fulfilling to him, because he knows he will most likely have additional financial responsibility in this future relationship. And the female knows the opposite. If she wants to start a family, there will likely come a time where she will have to take a paternity leave from work. And so her incentive is to find a career with some flexibility to it, even if it doesn't pay as well, and she also has an additional incentive to find a good man who is financially secure, which then just further incentivizes the male to achieve financial security if he wants to find a good woman who will make a good mother. The result of this is that there will, on average, just from the incentives, be some form of a wage gap. This also exposes a huge flaw with the leftist tendency to push victimhood narratives about these alleged unfair outcomes. Sure, the woman in this scenario is indeed earning less, but this doesn't mean that she has less. And guess what? That's exactly what the data shows. Women control 51% of personal wealth. So this leads a basic logic question. If a person A and person B live together, and person A earns 77% of what person B earns, but then person B gives an equivalent portion of their earnings to person A, well, who's really being shafted there? Oftentimes when you look at these alleged outcomes from a different angle, they aren't actually bad outcomes at all. People are just trading an outcome in one area of their life for another outcome in a different area. Men and women are just making logical decisions to reach a desired goal. The differences in the statistics along the way are simply due to the differences in how the incentives operate. And you can further prove this is the case by subtracting the family element from these incentives entirely. Guess what? When you do that, the wage gap completely vanishes. Single women who don't want a family, don't have children, and just focus on their career, when you look at young people who fit this and are just focusing on themselves, the wage gap reverses and women earn 8% more. And the feminists following the victimhood narrative are completely baffled by this and rush to find ridiculous explanations. Maybe the patriarchy is punishing women for having children. Maybe men oppress women in their relationship and force their wife to earn less through the perpetuation of these unfair gender stereotypes after they get married. Or maybe the economy specifically only discriminates against older women. No, people are just following their incentives based on innate differences. It's so painfully obvious when you apply incentives' intent and how they relate to human action. It's amazing how many people don't get this. And remember, this was all from, again, the extremely charitable position of assuming that the only innate difference is who births the child. let's crash back down to reality land where these innate differences are acknowledged. Men and women do not have the same psychology. We have very different IQ distributions, which lead to a greater number of both male idiots and male geniuses, which just this fact alone, by the way, offers an alternative explanation for most of feminist grievances, especially patriarchy. Men and women have hundreds of different physical differences that are a lot more than just eggs and sperm. Men and women's hormonal differences have a significant effect on brain chemistry. Women have greater language processing, while men have better spatial processing, and of course men and women are attracted to different things in a partner, even when you factor in LGBT into the equation. And none of these things have ever been adequately explained by the environmentalists. This is where the nugget of truth can be found in the manosphere. A lot of how our society functions and how our hierarchies form in regard to sex and gender are simply the result of these differences, not as some mysterious force of oppression. They also tend to look at it from the perspective of game and attraction. For instance, what if women are just naturally attracted to men who show qualities of competency and leadership? Well then, this just adds another incentive for men to aim for those roles, which just adds another layer of differences in outcome to exist by purely natural causes. If you apply all these facts to other areas of feminist theory by using the same rational flow of following incentives to their conclusions like I just did for the wage gap, we increasingly find this hundreds of years of oppression theory to be nothing more than dogma. Two groups with thousands of innate differences will not have the same incentives, will not have the same desires, and will thus obviously not have the same outcomes. This is not a bad thing, and it doesn't mean that one is inferior to the other. This is just the result of people with differences making free choices based on those differences. Now, what you just saw was an example of a rationalist argument that uses something called thymology. Thymology is a way of looking at history that deals with the mental activities of humanity and attempts to examine how those mental activities led them to act in the way that they did, in order to help create a qualitative analysis of the events that have transpired by looking at how the mind reacts to one's environment, which leads to the behavior that led to the event. Or in simpler terms, thymology attempts to understand the psychological motivations for why people made certain decisions, which then lets us better understand why certain things happened. Thymology is difficult to factor into data analysis because it deals with something that is invisible. However, science must acknowledge that it exists because obviously thoughts and motivations are very real things, otherwise you would not be watching this video, since something about the link or thumbnail that brought you here mentally motivated you to click on it. In the case of the wage gap, we keep seeing it prop up time and time again that the earnings of men and women are not the same. You can pick any year in history and you will probably find some sort of gap in pay there. Not just between men and women, but likely between various cultural and religious groups as well. In the case of the gender gap, we can use reasoning to determine that the motivations and incentives of men and women are not the same due to the differences in both our biological and social needs and beliefs in the way that we think, etc., etc. Any attempt to analyze the wage gap without acknowledging this is therefore pretty much doomed from the start. This exposes a flaw in how leftists tend to address these issues. They only focus on the quantitative while ignoring the qualitative. The concept of examining differences in motivations and other psychological factors which led to incentives and actions is often completely absent from their reasoning, and this results in them reaching these absurd conclusions that are based on an incomplete understanding at best and entirely circular or otherwise fallacious at worst. A good example of this can be found in Unlearning economics video on gender discrimination and the pay gap he made in response to Jordan Peterson. Now, I'm not going to go over this entire video and every single claim he makes in it, because for one, he makes a lot of claims about a lot of data, but also because when you understand the flaws in it, you will realize why it's not really necessary to go through each and every point that he makes. Now, the first and most obvious error he makes is, again, the lack of qualitative analysis. Feel free to watch the entire hour 22-minute video yourself. He does not mention incentives or motivations once. Yeah, big oof. Big oof. Now, I could argue that just from that error alone, because a very big error it is indeed, the entire video can be considered nonsensical. But that would be lazy as heck of me, and there are actually a few things in it that need to be directly called out and addressed. One major problem can be spotted right here.
These dynamics probably affect us all negatively, men and women alike, because they inhibit human flourishing and freedom. But the brunt of it falls on women, who have less access to resources, less recognition, and have to endure discrimination and harassment of various kinds.
Did you catch that? He's making a lot of sweeping claims, but the one that sticks out the most was less access to resources. While most of the claims made by people defending the existence of the pay gap are often just pointing to variables and empirical data and then claiming that they must be due to discrimination and whatnot via God of the Gap style reasoning, the data that they are pointing to usually at least does exist. Their reasoning behind it may be flawed, but the data usually does exist and does at least kind of say what they claim it says. It may not mean what they claim it means, though. But less access to resources is an interesting statement, because it's actually just flat out objectively not true. As I pointed out earlier, earn less does not equal have less. Women actually have just as much resource control as men, and are noticeably less likely to not have access to the essentials as men. For instance, they are less likely to be homeless than men, and the difference in food access for women living alone and men living alone is statistically insignificant, but has a noticeable drop for women who are married. And again, single women who do not have children do not have a wage gap. All of this suggests that women who are in a relationship and have children may indeed be earning less, but the father of her children or her husband then provides additional resources to her by giving her control over a portion of his own. Wow, it's almost like we have this cultural expectation that because men don't have to put up with childbirth, that men should therefore help take care of women, and that this expectation motivates our choices. Holy crap, whoever could have guessed. If we were to push this to its absurd conclusion, then we would have to assume that the richest 5-year-old child on the planet is actually just as poor as the poorest 5-year-old child on the planet, because neither of them are working or earning anything. It's a form of analysis that just completely ignores what their respective families are providing for them. It's totally ridiculous reasoning. This also offers an alternative explanation to the baby penalty that these people like to bring up as well. What if men with children are, again, just following their incentives to be a better breadwinner? What if the biological differences between men and women mean that the man has to work harder and the woman has to work less because, the biological reality of pregnancy? This blunder then reveals a huge flaw in his reasoning behind the pay gap.
It's still the case that education increases earnings. We've just found that occupation is the mechanism through which that happens. Now, in case you haven't spotted my devious plan, try substituting gender for education in our example. If women work in different occupations or carry different responsibilities, these things may reduce their pay. But noticing that these are the mechanisms does not mean the pay gap doesn't exist. It just tells us how it comes about.
So he makes the examination that controlling for occupation is not good control because it does not account for the possibility that people are facing gender discrimination in the hiring process or which career paths they are expected to take. And on the surface, this might seem like a good argument. But when you realize that earn less does not equal have less, and that differences in motivations and incentives offer an alternative explanation to difference in occupation and discrimination, the argument kinda starts to fall apart, because then we need to again add the family and children element back in here, because again, that's where the major differences in how men and women's motivations work. So when we factor in those motivations, we realize that we should probably check to see if this problem goes away when we take family and children out of the equation. Oh, look at that. A single woman without children earn more than men and are perfectly capable of finding good occupations. There's also numerous studies which suggest that hiring discrimination is not so clear-cut. For instance, one by Denise Venable suggests that women who are married greatly prefer part-time work over men in the same situation. So it's a chicken and egg sort of deal, which came first. The biggest problem with reasoning like this is it becomes extremely easy to generate variables that look like discrimination. Simply presume that the reason for things happening is discrimination, and then look for variables that seem to support that presumption. Then don't investigate any alternative explanations, don't engage in any qualitative reasoning, and then conclude that it's discrimination. For example, this clip.
And agreeable people get paid less than less agreeable people for the same job. Women are more agreeable than men.
There is more nuance than Peterson is letting on here. As the Blow and Kahn review states,
perhaps not surprising given labour market realities, Whaler and Plug, 2006, find in a regression context that men earned a premium for being disagreeable. However, this attribute was not found to be related to women's wages. Thus, the gender difference in agreeableness contributed to the gender earnings gap, both because men were considerably more disagreeable than women, but also because only men were awarded for this trait.
So the problem with this can be found by reading the study from Buehler and Plug. It uses the 5-factor personality model, which has the same central flaw that most of these studies have, which is that it relies almost entirely on self-reported data rather than actual observed behavior in the workplace. This might not seem like a big deal at first, until we remember the fact that men and women have some very complicated biological and psychological differences and needs. Which then leads us to the question, why should we assume that men and women on average mean the same thing when asked about how agreeable they are? What if men and women on average have a very different mental concept on what is and what is not agreeable behavior? Why should we assume that the sexes scale this concept in the same way? Thus, the problem here is that Unlearning is basically assuming that there is no innate difference between groups on this matter in order to essentially prove that there is no real difference other than discrimination. To further demonstrate why this is not valid reasoning at all, I will now do the exact same thing to prove that it is actually men who are being discriminated against. Now, I don't actually believe this, I'm just using it to prove a point. Now, the biggest evidence that we live in a misandrous matriarchy that devalues men can be seen in workplace fatalities. Year after year, men are roughly 10 times more likely to die on the job than women are. Now, people who deny that we live in a matriarchy might say that it has to do with the occupation choice and risk-taking. However, occupation has nothing to do with whether or not men are discriminated against, as men are clearly being pushed by social factors like male disposability into these jobs. And we can also control for risk-taking behavior. In a study by Nelson of Tufts University, we find that females being more risk-adverse can only account for 1/4 of the disparity in workplace deaths. So clearly, men who display risk avoidance does not always translate into decreased fatalities when compared to with women with the same personality traits. So clearly, some form of discrimination is taking place, and the matriarchy doesn't care about men's lives at all. If I had to guess, the matriarchy is clearly using MK Ultra to brainwash young men into taking on responsibilities without just compensation that ultimately leads to their doom. Okay, that last part about MK Ultra was obviously a joke. Really, the whole thing's a joke, but I think you get the point. The flaw in all that nonsense I just spouted is pretty much the same flaw that Unlearning was making. The study on risk-taking behavior used self-reported data for men and women on risk avoidance rather than actual observed actions. But why should we assume that men and women interpret such a question in the same way? Why should we assume the mental process of a man who considers himself a risk-taker is thinking exactly the same thing with the exact same motivations as a woman who says this? And again, how do we know that men aren't scaling what they consider to be risk aversion on a totally different level than women are? And why should we assume that there are no other factors that could possibly be at play? This is the problem with defaulting to discrimination as the answer. There are often alternative explanations that make just as much, if not more, sense. In both the argument presented by Unlearning and the fake argument I just presented, the reasoning error is the same: God of the gaps. Yes, qualitative factors are difficult to measure and in many cases cannot be measured, but that doesn't mean we can pretend that they don't exist. It just means that we don't really have a way of knowing for sure. So all Unlearning is doing here is filling the gaps of knowledge left open by the qualitative with discrimination. And unfortunately, it's very easy to generate these pseudo-intellectual arguments which claim that discrimination is happening when you do this, which again is why I'm not going to go over each and every claim he makes, because he repeats this error several times with various other datasets throughout his video, and once you know the problem with it, it's pretty easy to understand why this type of reasoning is incomplete at best. In many ways, this means the wage gap can be seen as one of the problems that come up when you encounter people who strictly utilized empiricism while rejecting the use of rationalism. These factors, which are difficult to measure and can often be seen as invisible, still have to be taken into account. Or in other words, just because it can't be counted doesn't mean it doesn't count. Whereas people like Unlearning are instead acting as if that which cannot be counted must therefore be treated as if it does not exist. Unless you want to try and argue that men and women don't have different motivations or thoughts, this is completely absurd. Now, I need to point out that none of what I have shown here means that men and women don't face any discrimination at all. That's not the point I'm making here. Perhaps some women really do exhibit the exact same version of disagreeableness in the exact same way as successful men do and don't get successful from it. And perhaps a cultural problem where we consider middle and lower class men to be disposable could in fact be the cause of some of men's higher chances to die in the workplace. However, when you realize that this is not something that can be measured by quantitative empirical data alone, it becomes blindingly obvious the factors are far too numerous and complex to ever know for sure just how much, if any, truly is the result of some form of unfairness. And because of this knowledge problem, the only way to fix it, if we were to try, would essentially be a totalitarian government that places equal outcomes above all else, a cure far worse than the alleged disease. But what we do know for a fact is that because most of these differences can be alternatively be explained by differences in incentives, motivations, and the resulting choices when pushed to their logical conclusions, the wise Today's move is thus to focus less on gender grievance politics and more on which of these choices people can actually aim for in order to improve their own quality of life. As far as when it comes to women, there are a few pitfalls that stand out that our current cultural climate honestly does not do a very good job warning young ladies to stay away from. For instance, avoiding single motherhood. Seriously, stop having children out of wedlock with losers. This is one of the biggest factors that regularly results in women having a bad time. Also, avoid useless degrees like gender studies. These teach you absolutely nothing of value. I would not be surprised at all if many employers who see this send all resumes with garbage like that directly into the trash bin as soon as they see what you went to school for. In general, women are probably better off just avoiding gender grievance and identity politics altogether. The victimhood mindset that a lot of these grievance grifters are selling has been repeatedly proven to lead to severe mental health issues. The harsh truth is that the political factions that push hard on gender inequality are really just trying to convince women that they are victims of the patriarchy so that they can be manipulated into supporting woke-toid ideology. This is nothing more than a grift that is designed to take advantage of women who are young and insecure and then trick them into supporting ridiculous forced equity policies that ultimately will not help. Anyways, that's all I have to say on this subject for now. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like, leave me a tip on my Ko-Fi, subscribe, and all that good stuff. Till next time.